Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 147 of The Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, I want to take an opportunity to highlight a recent publication milestone that I was a part of. Frontiers in Psychology recently published a paper that I co-authored along with Jared Brown, Megan Carter, and Vanessa Spiller. The paper is entitled Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder and the Risk-Need-Responsivity Model, a guide for criminal justice and forensic mental health professionals. The article was published on January 27th of 2023. I, of course, will leave a link for the article in the description of this episode. So if you want to check out that paper, and I strongly encourage that you do, you can go ahead and follow the link in the description of this podcast. Today, I want to begin by providing an overview of that paper and then pose some questions and challenges to you, the listener. Perhaps before I dive into an overview of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and then subsequently the implications for those operating under the risk-need-responsivity framework, I'm just going to go ahead and read the abstract of the paper. As you know, that provides a great overview of the content. I think it'll help set the stage for this episode, if you will. So please, again, indulge me while I read from our abstract. Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder, FASD, is an umbrella term used to describe a range of significant neurodevelopmental, brain-based disorders and impairments that result from prenatal alcohol exposure. FASD, again, Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder, is a high prevalence but underdiagnosed group of disorders affecting between 17 and 36% of individuals in criminal justice settings. Now, despite being a high-impact disorder associated with lifelong impairments and a significant need for services and interventions, little research has been completed on how to best support individuals with these conditions in criminal justice settings. Our article proposes a renewed focus on applying and adapting the risk-need-responsivity approach to individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in criminal justice settings. This will assist in better determining the needs and interventions likely to affect change and reduce recidivism for this prominent criminal justice-based population. The RNR approach has been used with multiple corrections populations to determine the need and most appropriate interventions, as well as how to best allocate scarce resources. As the prevalence of FASD becomes better understood and recognized, evidence-based approaches to addressing this specific subpopulation are necessary to affect change and reduce recidivism and ongoing involvement in the criminal justice system. Now, if you are a regular listener of this podcast, you are likely at least familiar with the principles of risk, need, and responsivity. I'm going to circle back to those implications later in this episode, but to kick things off, I want to shine some light on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or again, FASD. Perhaps the first thing I want to highlight is merely the prevalence of FASD among justice-impacted individuals. FASD is a high prevalence, but again, really underdiagnosed group of disorders affecting between, as I just noted, 17 and 36% of individuals in criminal justice settings. Now, I know that's a bit of a range there, 17 to 36%, but if you are working with justice-involved individuals, if you are in corrections, if you are a probation or parole officer, consider that for a moment. Consider the fact that between, even if we said 20 and 30% of your cases fell under this diagnosis. 2 out of 10, 3 out of 10, that's a pretty substantial portion of your caseload to be unaware of this phenomenon. Last week, we had Nicole Kimberly Staley on the show talking all about the considerations of a trauma history and how a lack of those considerations is really going to impact the efficacy of our cognitive behavioral interventions. I contend that we need to have that same awareness around fetal alcohol spectrum disorder as we do around trauma in corrections, or else our impact when we are implementing these proven interventions, these evidence-based practices, that the impact is really going to be hobbled or neutered, if you will. And that's what I want to get into in this episode. And indeed, that's what the paper that we published really highlights as well. And speaking of trauma, one of the things I discovered on this journey in our research is the fact that when you talk about trauma, it often leads back to a conversation around ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences, and we're beginning to learn all of the implications of not being aware of that in our correctional approaches. Well, the prevalence of ACEs in individuals with FASD is greatly increased compared to people without FASD. This is important to know if you are endeavoring to be more trauma-informed in your approaches, knowing that the prevalence of ACEs is even higher if your client has FASD. We have also talked quite a bit on this show about neuroscience and neurocriminology, and in those conversations talked all about the importance of executive functioning. Well, deficits in executive functioning are common difficulties in problem solving, impaired judgment, poor decision-making skills, a diminished ability to comprehend the cause and effect of their actions and behaviors with individuals with FASD. And we know the importance of executive functioning when we are trying to implement cognitive behavioral interventions with our clients. Yet another reason to be aware of this phenomenon if your client has FASD. And we contend in our paper that from the perspective of the FASD population, it may be beneficial to look at the symptoms commonly associated with FASD. Again, these are executive functioning deficits, adaptive functioning deficits, academic or learning deficits, and self-regulation deficits. Let's just look at those from as a starting point, if you will, as they relate to the Risk-Need-Responsivity model. Now, I mentioned executive functioning a few times. Let's just consider that for a moment. Deficits associated with executive functioning may be reflected in those criminogenic variables of criminal history, pro-criminal attitudes, and antisocial personality pattern. If we look at low self-regulation and impulsivity, we know that those are captured within the domain of criminal history within that risk-need-responsivity framework. Yet, an individual's criminal history is traditionally viewed as a static factor, one that cannot be changed. And we contend that's really an outdated approach now. That is to say, if you conduct an assessment and you look at one's criminal history / low self-regulation as a predictor of future recidivism, that's one thing. But to ignore it and say that we can't get at the root cause of that, which again is low self-regulation, that's a horse of a different color. And I mentioned as well another impairment of FASD being that of adaptive functioning. Now let's think about this. That could result in difficulties with reading and writing, which of course would be captured within that criminogenic domain of education and employment. Cognition, another FASD brain impairment, could be linked once again to the criminogenic domains of pro-criminal attitudes and antisocial personality pattern. And cognitive deficits could be aligned with deficits around education and employment. And I'm really just scratching the surface when we talk about the effect of the efficacy of our evidence-based practices if we're not aware of FASD. Please read the paper. I encourage you to do so. But let me say that we also concluded that education and awareness are the first step, but it will really come down to proper implementation and training. Establishing a correctional assessment and treatment workflow following those risk-need-responsivity principles is, yes, an important first step in establishing appropriate interventions to reduce recidivism among individuals diagnosed with FASD. But the simple check in the box implementation of that workflow doesn't mean it will be adhered to in practice. This lack of implementation fidelity is commonplace for a variety of reasons, including things such as lack of program funding, lack of trained staff, poor cooperation from the clients, and I could go on and on. I'm likely preaching to the choir when I talk about the struggles of implementation in a criminal justice setting. Now, we know that this lack of fidelity can result in risk-need tools such as the LSCMI, the YLS, being administered but not used to target those criminogenic needs in a responsive manner. And our contention with this paper is that any such training on the risk-need-responsivity model should be supplemented by continuing education in the signs and symptoms of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and how they may impact the effectiveness of otherwise evidence-based assessments and treatment techniques. Let me provide some illustrations and perhaps even a case study, if you will, between two clients with and without FASD, and that might shine a light on the gravity of this. Two things which the paper talks about in relation to individuals with FASD are the phenomenon of confabulation and suggestibility. These were two things that I had not even heard of before I started this journey with Dr. Brown and his team. But as a big proponent of risk assessment, I was shocked to learn that I'm training folks to do assessments and we don't have this information. And I think you'll see the implications as well when I define these two things. So confabulation refers to people replacing gaps in their memory with imaginary material that they believe to be true. So if you routinely conduct risk-need assessments, think about how that phenomenon of confabulation would have an effect on the accuracy, among other things, of your risk assessment. I'm going to repeat that definition. Confabulation refers to people replacing gaps in their memory with imaginary material that they believe to be true. The extent to which people confabulate when reporting an event may be important when assessing the reliability of testimony given by witnesses, victims, and suspects, but we contend that consideration should be extended to persons undergoing a risk-need assessment interview. That second phenomenon that I perhaps introduced you to was that of suggestibility. Suggestibility is, as the name implies, you're prone to suggestions. The suggestibility of a person with FASD means that they are more likely to just graciously concur with propositions that are put to them by the practitioner in interviews, whether that's a police officer, a probation officer, a parole officer conducting a risk assessment. FASD's social and cognitive deficits, they really predispose individuals to suggestibility, which again is an inclination to agree with others. Think of it that way. And now think beyond that. What might that inclination look like within a risk-need assessment that could really just lead to results that concur with leading questions? This has come up in area of false confessions and ultimately wrongly convicted people, but it made me really consider, well, if the research has looked about it as it affects false confessions and wrongful convictions, why don't we consider the effect of suggestibility on the inaccuracy of a risk-need assessment and how that, by extension, will affect accurate case planning, accurate use of cognitive behavioral interventions, accurate application of any of our other evidence-based practices? I really started thinking when researching this paper, is there an overrepresentation of certain things that we might look at as criminogenic, but perhaps they're not within this FASD population? So, for example, things like executive functioning impairments, that's going to be detected within an RNR assessment and perhaps interpreted as criminogenic, or antisocial personality pattern, or, as we said, low self-regulation is really a proxy for criminal history, but might this lack of impulse control, low self-regulation, be misinterpreted as criminogenic when it perhaps falls more into that FASD lane? And if these variables are a result of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and this is crucial to hear, unlike other correctional clients, the FASD cognitive impairments are irreversible. And the root cause of impulsivity and impaired judgment cannot be addressed. So the fact that the most powerful arsenal in the probation officer's toolbox, cognitive behavioral interventions, appears to be negated with an FASD client, and that warrants considerable reflection and consideration, I think, in the field. And lest you are wondering, we are going to now provide you some strategies for the probation and parole officer who are conducting these interviews if, again, they suspect the client has FASD. The good news is Dr. Brown and his colleagues have previously published strategies which can be utilized in the interview process for criminal justice professionals, and many of these dovetail quite nicely with the best practices that we currently train on when training on effective risk assessment interview approaches. Let me just review some of those for you now at this time. The probation officer who is conducting that risk-need assessment on an individual with suspected or confirmed FASD should be aware of the fact that their client will generally function at a higher level if they're interviewed in a structured and predictable environment. Now, it's considered a best practice in risk assessment interviewing to begin the process with what we refer to as a good structuring statement. In other words, explain the purpose of the interview to your client. This would also entail an explanation that collateral information may be collected, which is to say, hey, listen, I might be reaching out to a spouse or a partner or a employer or a previous probation officer and, offer them that feedback if interested. Also note to the client that the interview will entail you asking a series of information gathering questions. And then finally, explain how the interview is going to conclude. For example, we're going to go back and fill in any gaps in information, address any red flags that may have come up during this interview process, and things of that nature. Now, I need to point out that without this structure, the FASD client may appear angry, withdrawn, frustrated, or even irritable. Again, this is behavior which could be misinterpreted as risk factors. Again, when I train on risk assessment and I talk about the presence of anger and frustration and irritability, without this FASD knowledge, those could be misinterpreted as criminogenic. Probation officers should also be aware that individuals with FASD often have the developmental functioning of someone half their chronological age. This is a phenomenon known as dysmaturity. Now, as opposed to immaturity, dysmaturity results in a person not having the ability to communicate commensurate with their actual chronological age. Another best practice or strategy for the probation officer would be to really consider the duration of the interview. All right. Probation officers should be aware that persons with FASD generally work harder to focus on social interactions and may not be able to handle the duration of a lengthy assessment interview. I know that when I train these, I tell practitioners, listen, these interviews may take 45 minutes to an hour. So if you are dealing with a suspected or confirmed FASD client, consider breaks in the assessment process to avoid that client becoming withdrawn or even emotionally volatile. And to gain accurate information, again, consider taking breaks. I don't know if I've ever trained POs to consider taking a break in the interview process. Another strategy would be to really make strides to avoid an interview that is laced with anxiety. And I know that's really hard when we're talking about a non-voluntary population, but we know the detrimental effects that that's going to have when it comes to the accuracy of your risk assessment if it's with an FASD individual. Here's another strategy that may be new to some of you interviewers, assessment practitioners. Allow physical activity, along the lines of pacing or letting that client doodle or just even allowing that client to fidget with objects during the interview. We know that persons with FASD find that their brains function better when their bodies are engaged in some form of movement. Again, maybe a little radical if you're saying to yourself, I've conducted hundreds of thousands of interviews, but I've never allowed for them to pace during the interview or doodle or again, even fidget, but we know from best practices with FASD clientele, that's actually a good strategy. A first step in bringing this issue to the fore in community corrections may simply be better screening of correctional clients for FASD. Unfortunately, few such screening tools currently exist. The goal of such screening tools would be first to identify the precursors and indicators of FASD in correctional clients. Now, I know some of you may be thinking to yourselves right now, time out, Joe. I know that when I conduct, for example, a level of service case management or LSCMI assessment, when you get into those subsequent sections of the tool, there is a checkbox asking about the presence of FASD, but I will contend it is grossly undertrained and grossly underutilized, rather, knowing everything that I know now about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and everything when I juxtapose my training experience with the LSCMI. We're really doing this population a disservice by relegating all of those considerations to, again, one checkbox within Section 2 or Section 5 of the LSCMI, whichever it may be. I know I promised a case study, so let's take a stab at that. If you're like me, when I was learning about this information, my brain immediately went to the case management implications. And so to that end, I'm going to paint a picture of a mock client here by the name of Tommy. And let's assume Tommy is an FASD client, but the probation officer is not aware of that. And let's consider some of those case management implications. What I'm going to do is read to you from the perspective of Tommy with FASD what that risk-need-responsivity assessment may have sounded like, or what Tommy's experience would have been during that interview process if his probation officer was unaware of his FASD and did not consider his FASD. So let's maybe look at this from Tommy's perspective for a moment. Tommy wondered how many more questions he would be asked. It reminded him of the time after his last arrest when the police officer kept asking him questions. Just as he did then, he found himself agreeing with whatever was asked of him. The nature of the questions kept bouncing about, from his past troubles with the law, to the jobs he has held, to questions about his drug and alcohol use, and now to his family. Tommy struggled to answer questions relating to his own family or other questions as to his current and past relationships. The longer the interview dragged on, the angrier and more suspicious Tommy grew. His anger resulted in more feverish note-taking from his inquisitor, which made him even more suspicious. He was soon saying anything that he thought would shorten his time with this person. Tommy was eventually asked if he would like to hear some initial feedback, but he bolted from the room without even answering the question. Let us proceed to consider some case management implications from this, I would contend, inaccurate risk assessment based on the fact that Tommy was an FASD client and these behaviors could be linked to that versus criminogenic variables. Tommy's actual criminogenic needs would be in the areas of education and employment, family, and leisure and recreational pursuits. But the results based on his inaccurate assessment would target his antisocial peers and address his criminal orientation, those risky thinking patterns, and focus on his antisocial personality pattern. And by extension, his inaccurate case plan goals would be to complete cognitive behavior programming to address his criminal orientation, or even one-on-one cognitive behavioral interventions to avoid negative peers and to augment his pro-social relationships. But they fail to address his actual needs around education, employment, family, and even those pro-social, leisure, recreational pursuits in life. And I'm going to repeat this because it's really important to point this out. FASD cognitive impairments are irreversible. And it's the FASD that is the root cause of their impulsivity and their impaired judgment. And for some of those clients, even their use of alcohol and drug use. And so essentially that the tip of the spear for future focused correctional practitioners, cognitive behavioral interventions, may be blunted with FASD clientele. According to Dr. Brown and his colleagues, the use of traditional cognitive behavioral techniques is inappropriate for most individuals with FASD. Rather, Dr. Brown and colleagues contend those persons would respond better to a behavioral approach. They need to be active participants and use visible cues, get immediate feedback, and see and examine those results. Cognitive restructuring, a major tenet of cognitive behavioral interventions in corrections, looks different for an FASD population. It occurs through a complex interaction of psychomotor circuitry. That's sort of that apprentice style learning. In other words, just more of a hands-on approach. Think of the lecture-heavy approach of a lot of our cognitive behavioral groups. That's just not going to land with an FASD client. Now, at this point, I suspect what some of you may be thinking is, time out, Joe, when you talk about responsivity, general responsivity is referred to as the adopting of cognitive behavioral interventions to address those criminogenic factors. That is to say, those interventions which are cognitive-based have the best efficacy. That's the bad news. The good news is we can really lean into specific responsivity, which entails how to deliver services that are conducive to engagement and learning. We contend if the probation officer is unaware of FASD, then how can an effective classroom, if you will, be built? Now, if you typically train structured cognitive programs such as thinking for a change or decision points or any other cognitive interventions which are classroom based, I really encourage you to read our paper and consider some of those factors. But this extends beyond that. Even if you're doing one-on-one cognitive work, or even if you work in a correctional facility, you really need to be more informed when it comes to fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. If you work again in that traditional correctional setting, a jail or a prison, and you're working with residents and inmates, be aware that the FASD inmate is going to have difficulty following rules and routines. That's part of their FASD. It should not be interpreted as a sign of opposition or defiance. The FASD inmate may not interact well socially with inmates and staff. Again, think of how that's going to be misinterpreted. That FASD inmate will be more prone to be both the victim and the victimizer, and likely perceived by staff to be the inmate that is lazy or manipulative or self-defeating and irritating. And if you're working in a juvenile facility, FASD youth typically respond to confrontation or conflict with aggression. You really need to arm yourselves with the knowledge behind FASD if you work in a correctional setting. Let me conclude with just a few more strategies moving forward, and then we'll wrap up this episode. There are currently few FASD screening tools in use today in the correctional world. We contend that needs to change. Were those in place, individuals identified with FASD could be triaged for appropriate case management services. And we also feel that probation agreements, probation officers need to be outlined clearly. Oftentimes, that probation agreement is sort of at the crux of the relationship between the client and the practitioner. But if those are not outlined clearly, well, the person with FASD may be able to, repeat the probation orders and even explain what they mean back. But in reality, they will be unable to follow through with those conditions when in the community. And again, without being aware of their FASD, that's going to be misinterpreted and arguably considered as a probation violation. We know that oftentimes program failure is a violation of release or a violation of probation. But if we don't understand the root causes of those program failures, we're really doing a disservice to our clients. You who are facilitators of groups in corrections and other settings really need to endeavor to learn more about your participants and the phenomenon of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and take measures if you have confirmed or suspected FASD clients in those groups. Those begin with creating a calm learning environment, free from clutter and other distractions, and focus task presented in small steps. Allow personal space for the client with plenty of support and praise. If possible, use visual structuring or really lean into those scripted role play activities. Those are going to land much better on the FASD client. To conclude, I'd just like you to take away the fact that fetal alcohol spectrum disorders are a significantly misunderstood but prevalent problem in the criminal justice system. Now, while 1 to 10% of the general population meets criteria for an FASD, 17 to 36% of individuals in the criminal justice system meet the criteria. Many have not yet been identified due to the lack of knowledge about FASD by criminal justice professionals and the lack of adequate screening and assessment. Our article provides information to propose a renewed focus on applying and adopting the risk-need-responsivity approach to individuals with FASD in criminal justice settings. By adequately assessing their needs and adopting interventions following the RNR model for individualized intervention to best meet their needs and reduce recidivism. Despite basic research about the prevalence of FASD in criminal justice populations, further research is needed to explore the reasons for this high prevalence rate, as well as to identify risk-need assessment, treatment approaches, and interviewing guidelines and their applicability for this highly vulnerable clinical population when encountered in forensic settings. The Risk-Need-Responsivity model is a well-established evidence-based approach to lower recidivism with justice-involved individuals. The efficacy of the model rests on those three interwoven principles of risk, need, and responsivity. The key to success, though, lies in the fidelity to each of these principles while accounting for individual differences due to FASD. All three of these principles lose potency if FASD considerations are not taken into consideration in their application. Accurate assessment should include FASD-specific symptoms and functioning to ensure the person is not over or under supervised, which would result in either increased recidivism or the unnecessary use of valuable resources. Our paper makes 6 key points, which, in conclusion, I would like to summarize for you. Number 1, the Risk-Need-Responsivity model is an evidence-based framework designed to reduce future recidivism in general offender populations. 2. Although applied to those with FASD in practice due to their overrepresentation in the criminal justice setting, little research has been conducted specifically on this population and how the RNR principles may best be applied to those with FASD. 3. Further research is needed to establish a risk assessment process which can accurately and reliably predict recidivism among individuals diagnosed with FASD and specifically take into account the vulnerabilities that arise as a result of their severe neurodevelopmental impairments. 4. Best practice interviewing guidelines for individuals diagnosed with FASD need to be established so that the benefits of increasingly accurate information, including the gathering of collateral information, can be allowed to flow through to the provision of more appropriate and successful interventions. Number 5. Criminal justice and forensic mental health professionals need to be knowledgeable of and responsive to the cognitive and adaptive impairments associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. That's a big one, folks. Finally, training is critical to the faithful implementation of risk-need assessments and treatment approaches in the general criminal justice population, and even more so with the FASD population, given their highly complex presentations and heightened vulnerabilities. As noted, I will leave a link to our article in the description of this podcast episode. I encourage you to check that article out. And I've been talking about the need for training and information. If you are intrigued and would like to learn more, reach out to me and we can arrange some type of communication, training, what have you. Dr. Brown and I will be having such a conversation with our friends north of the border this spring. So if you are organizing a conference, looking for research papers to highlight, reach out to the show and we would love to tell you all about our paper on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and its implications within the risk-need-responsivity model. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, program design, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We are also on Twitter. The Criminologist Media Group can be followed at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast. And of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.